I was a waitress betrayed by my boss, and as I stood in his office watching him slide that final paycheck across his mahogany desk with a smirk that made my stomach turn, I knew this wasn't just about losing a job. This was about watching 3 years of loyalty get fed through a paper shredder while he counted his dirty money. The fluorescent light above his desk flickered as he leaned back in his leather chair, fingers drummed against the armrest in that practiced rhythm of a man who'd done this before. His eyes held that cold satisfaction of someone who thought they'd just solved a problem by making it someone else's. The severance papers sat there like a death certificate, the ink still wet from his signature, and I could smell the expensive cologne he wore to mask the stench of his corruption. Marcus Chen had built Romano's Italian bistro from nothing, or so the story went. What the health inspectors and tax auditors didn't know was that his nothing had been built on a foundation of skimmed cash, unreported tips, and a payroll system that existed more in imagination than reality. I'd watched him for 3 years, seen the way he handled cash transactions, observed how certain receipts never made it to the register, noticed how the books always seemed to balance just a little too perfectly. But I'd been loyal, stupidly, blindly loyal. The betrayal hadn't come with fanfare or drama. It had arrived wrapped in the mundane cruelty of a Tuesday afternoon staff meeting. Marcus had gathered us in the back room, his management team flanking him like bodyguards, and systematically dismantled my reputation with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The missing inventory he'd claimed, the customer complaints that had never reached my tables, the cash drawer discrepancies that coincidentally aligned with my shifts. Each accusation had landed like a physical blow, and I'd watched my co-workers' faces transform from confusion to suspicion to the kind of righteous anger reserved for thieves and liars. Sarah, who'd trained me on my first day, wouldn't meet my eyes. Tommy, who'd covered my shifts when my mother was in the hospital, shook his head with disappointment that felt like betrayal layered on betrayal. The evidence was fabricated, but it was thorough. Marcus had spent weeks constructing my downfall, creating a paper trail that painted me as everything I'd never been: dishonest, unreliable, toxic to the team dynamic. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who'd built his success on lies was destroying me with more lies, but irony doesn't pay rent or restore reputation. As I'd packed my belongings from the small locker we shared behind the kitchen, my hands had shaken with a rage so pure it felt volcanic. But I'd kept my face neutral, my movements controlled, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was already forming. Not the hot, immediate revenge of throwing plates or making scenes, but something colder, more surgical, more permanent. That night, I'd sat in my studio apartment with a glass of wine and a laptop, staring at the business license Marcus had so proudly framed behind the host station. Romano's Italian Bistro, LLC. Established 2019. The numbers had always bothered me, not because they were wrong, but because they were too right, too clean, too convenient for a business that dealt primarily in cash transactions with a clientele that preferred anonymity. The plan had started as curiosity. I'd worked in restaurants long enough to know the difference between creative bookkeeping and outright fraud, and Marcus had crossed that line so many times he'd worn a path through it. The question wasn't whether he was cheating on his taxes, it was how extensively, how systematically, and how documented his crimes were. I'd started small. Public records, business filings, permit applications. The kind of information any citizen could access with enough patience and the right search terms. What I'd found was a masterclass in financial fiction. Romano's reported revenue consistently hovered just below the threshold that would trigger automatic audits, yet the restaurant was packed every weekend with customers paying $40 for pasta dishes that cost $3 to make. The real discovery had come by accident. I'd been researching competitors in the area, trying to understand the market Marcus operated in, when I'd stumbled across a business registration for RM Holdings, LLC. The filing date was 6 months after Romano's had opened, and the registered agent was someone named Robert Martinez, which I'd realized with a cold thrill of recognition, shared the same initials as Romano's Italian Bistro. Marcus wasn't just skimming from his restaurant. He was running money through multiple entities, creating a shell game that would have impressed the IRS if they'd known to look for it. But they hadn't known to look because Marcus had been careful, methodical, and smart enough to keep his fraud just sophisticated enough to avoid casual detection. That's where I came in. The research had consumed my unemployed weeks like a fever. I'd mapped Marcus's financial ecosystem with the dedication of an accountant and the patience of a detective, following paper trails that led from Romano's to RM Holdings to a half-dozen other entities scattered across different states, all connected by the same careful handwriting on incorporation papers and the same pattern of revenue reporting that danced just below regulatory radar. Every morning, I'd walk past Romano's on my way to job interviews, watching the lunch rush through windows that had once felt like home. Marcus would be there, greeting customers with that practiced charm, his smile genuine enough to fool anyone who didn't know how easily he could manufacture sincerity when it suited his purposes. He'd built trust like currency, spending it carefully to maintain the illusion of legitimacy while systematically stealing from the system that had allowed him to prosper. The evidence had mounted slowly, then all at once. Bank statements I'd photographed during late-night closings when I'd still been trusted with keys. Supplier invoices that didn't match the quantities we'd actually received. Cash transactions that had been recorded in a secondary ledger Marcus kept in his office safe. The same safe I'd seen him open dozens of times, never imagining I'd been memorizing the combination unconsciously. Getting back into the restaurant had required patience and planning. Marcus changed the locks after firing me, but he'd forgotten about the delivery entrance that stayed propped open during prep hours. On a Thursday afternoon when the kitchen staff was focused on weekend prep and Marcus was at his weekly Chamber of Commerce meeting, I'd slipped in through the back like a ghost returning to haunt familiar territory. The office safe had opened with 3 soft clicks, revealing not just cash but a treasure trove of documentation Marcus had been too paranoid to trust to digital storage. The secondary books, the real books, told a story of systematic tax evasion that spanned the restaurant's entire existence. Every cash transaction, every unreported tip, every piece of inventory that had been purchased with cash and never recorded, it was all there, documented in Marcus's own handwriting with the kind of detail that would make an IRS investigator weep with joy. I'd photographed everything, working with the mechanical precision of someone who knew this was their only opportunity. The camera app on my phone had captured page after page of evidence that painted a picture of fraud so comprehensive, so systematic, that it would be impossible to dismiss as accidental or oversightual. But documentation was only half the battle. The IRS receives thousands of tax fraud reports every year, and most of them disappear into bureaucratic black holes, filed away by agents who don't have time to investigate every disgruntled employee's accusations. I needed something more than evidence. I needed a compelling narrative that would make Marcus Chen a priority. That narrative had come together over weeks of careful preparation. I'd researched the IRS's whistleblower program, understanding not just how to report fraud, but how to report it in a way that would guarantee action. The key was presentation. Not just what you reported, but how you reported it. The story you told about why it mattered beyond just lost tax revenue. Marcus had been stealing from more than just the government. His systematic fraud had given him an unfair competitive advantage over every legitimate restaurant in the area. While his competitors paid full taxes on their revenue, Marcus was operating with a cost structure that let him undercut prices and pocket the difference. It wasn't just tax evasion, it was market manipulation on a scale that hurt every honest business owner trying to compete in the same space. The IRS form had been deceptively simple. 23 pages that would reshape Marcus's world with the clinical efficiency of a surgical strike. I'd filled it out with the care of someone drafting a legal document, providing not just allegations but evidence, not just suspicions but documentation, not just accusations but a roadmap that would lead investigators directly to the heart of Marcus's financial empire. Form 3949-A. Information referral. The title made it sound bureaucratic, mundane, but what I was filing was a guided missile aimed at everything Marcus had built through lies and theft. Every bank account, every shell company, every unreported transaction, I'd laid it all out with the precision of someone who understood that details matter, that credibility is built through specificity, that the difference between ignored reports and investigated cases often comes down to how well the whistleblower has done their homework. The supporting documentation had filled a manila envelope thick enough to require extra postage: bank statements, supplier invoices, photographs of the secondary ledger, copies of business registrations for the shell companies, even credit card receipts showing personal expenses being run through business accounts. It was a prosecutor's dream, a defense attorney's nightmare, and an IRS investigator's ticket to a significant case that would justify their department's budget. But I hadn't stopped with the IRS. Marcus's fraud had tentacles that reached into state tax systems, local business licensing, even immigration enforcement, since several of his shell companies had been used to employ workers who existed on paper but never showed up for shifts. Each agency would conduct their own investigation, but together they'd create a web that Marcus couldn't escape through legal maneuvering or selective cooperation. The waiting had been the hardest part. Federal investigations move with geological slowness, measured not in days or weeks but in quarters and fiscal years. But I'd known the wheels were turning when Marcus started showing signs of stress during the third month after my report. His usual confident demeanor had developed cracks, small things that probably no one else noticed, but which stood out to someone who'd observed him closely for 3 years. He'd started checking his phone obsessively during dinner service, stepping away from customer conversations to take calls that left him distracted and irritable. His usual careful attention to detail had slipped. I'd noticed during my reconnaissance walks that tables weren't being reset as precisely, that servers were making mistakes that would have earned sharp corrections in the past. The first official notice had arrived on a Wednesday. I'd seen the IRS agent through the window, a thin woman in a gray suit carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she wasn't there for a routine compliance check. Marcus had met her at the front door, his body language shifting from confusion to concern to something approaching panic as she'd presented her credentials and requested access to his financial records. That meeting had lasted 3 hours. I'd positioned myself in the coffee shop across the street, nursing a latte and watching through binoculars as Marcus's carefully constructed world began its first tremor. The agent had left with copies of documents, business cards had been exchanged, and Marcus had stood in his doorway afterward, looking like someone who'd just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. But the IRS had been just the beginning. The state tax authority had arrived the following week, then the Department of Labor investigating his payroll practices, then immigration enforcement looking into his hiring records. Each visit had layered additional pressure, additional scrutiny, additional documentation of the systematic fraud that had funded Marcus's lifestyle for 5 years. I'd watched him deteriorate with the clinical fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. The stress had manifested physically: weight loss that made his expensive suits hang loose, dark circles under his eyes that concealer couldn't hide, a nervous tic where he'd tap his fingers against his leg when he thought no one was looking. The restaurant itself had started showing signs of the mounting pressure. Staff turnover had increased as Marcus became more irritable and demanding. Customer service had declined as he'd become distracted and paranoid. Even the food quality had suffered as he'd started cutting corners to manage cash flow that was being strangled by legal fees and reduced revenue from decreased customer satisfaction. But Marcus had fought back with the desperation of someone who knew everything was at stake. He'd hired lawyers, accountants, consultants who specialized in tax disputes. He'd tried to negotiate settlements, plea bargains, payment plans, anything that would allow him to keep Romano's operating while managing the fallout from his exposed fraud. The turning point had come 4 months after my initial report. I'd received a call from the IRS whistleblower office, not the generic thank you form letter I'd expected, but an actual phone conversation with the investigating agent who'd been assigned to my case. She'd wanted to meet, to go over my evidence in detail, to understand the full scope of what I'd uncovered. That meeting had taken place in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic efficiency. Agent Patricia Wong had spread my documentation across a table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, asking detailed questions about dates, amounts, procedures, and Marcus's personal involvement in each aspect of the fraud. Her questions had been specific, targeted, the kind that suggested she'd already conducted her own investigation and was using my evidence to fill in gaps rather than starting from scratch. She'd wanted to know about the secondary ledger, about Marcus's cash handling procedures, about the shell companies and how money moved between them. By the end of that 3-hour meeting, I'd understood that Marcus wasn't just facing tax penalties. He was looking at criminal charges, federal prosecution, the kind of systematic fraud investigation that destroys businesses, ruins reputations, and sends people to prison for years rather than months. Agent Wong had explained the whistleblower reward system, how individuals who provide information leading to successful tax fraud prosecutions can receive up to 30% of the recovered amount. Based on her preliminary calculations, Marcus owed the federal government approximately $2.7 million in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest. My share of that recovery could be substantial enough to justify the months of unpaid investigation work I'd invested in bringing him down. But the money had never been the point. This was about justice, about the satisfaction of watching someone who'd built success on lies face consequences for their systematic dishonesty. Marcus had destroyed my reputation to cover his own crimes, and now those same crimes were going to destroy everything he'd built. The raid had happened on a Tuesday morning during breakfast prep. I'd positioned myself in the parking lot across from Romano's, armed with coffee and a camera with a telephoto lens, determined to document the moment Marcus's world finally collapsed completely. 6 federal agents had arrived in unmarked cars, moving with the professional efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. They'd entered through both the front door and the delivery entrance, cutting off any possible escape routes, their presence immediately transforming the restaurant from a place of business into a crime scene. Marcus had been in his office when they'd arrived, and I'd watched through the window as Agent Wong had presented the search warrant, while 2 other agents had positioned themselves to ensure compliance. His face had gone through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, anger, and finally a kind of defeated resignation as the full weight of his situation had settled on him like a physical force. The search had been thorough and methodical. Every filing cabinet, every computer, every piece of paper that could potentially contain evidence had been photographed, cataloged, and either copied or seized entirely. The safe I'd accessed months earlier had been opened with cutting tools, its contents adding to the mountain of evidence that would support the criminal case being built against Marcus. But the most satisfying moment had been watching Marcus himself during those hours of systematic dismantling. He'd aged years in the space of a morning, his careful composure finally cracking as he'd realized the full scope of his exposure. The confident businessman who'd destroyed my reputation with manufactured evidence was being destroyed by real evidence, authentic documentation of crimes he'd actually committed. The staff had been interviewed separately. Each server and cook and dishwasher asked detailed questions about cash handling procedures, unreported tips, off-the-books payments, and any other irregularities they'd witnessed during their employment. Several of them had provided information that corroborated my report, adding layers of witness testimony that would make Marcus's prosecution almost inevitable. By afternoon, Romano's had been closed indefinitely, yellow tape across the doors, and a notice of federal investigation posted where the daily specials used to be displayed. Marcus's carefully constructed empire had collapsed in a single morning, reduced from a thriving business to a crime scene in less time than it took to serve a 4-course meal. The criminal charges had been filed 2 weeks later: mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, a federal prosecutor's greatest hits collection that could result in decades of prison time if Marcus was convicted on all counts. The indictment had been detailed and comprehensive, laying out a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned Romano's entire existence and involved every aspect of the business operations. Marcus had tried to negotiate a plea bargain, offering to pay restitution and accept limited prison time in exchange for avoiding a trial that would expose every detail of his fraud to public scrutiny. But the prosecutor had been confident in her case, armed with documentation and witness testimony that made conviction appear virtually certain. The trial had been scheduled for 6 months later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Marcus had retained expensive defense attorneys who'd promised to fight every charge, to challenge every piece of evidence, to create enough reasonable doubt to avoid conviction. But I'd seen that evidence, helped gather much of it, and I knew that reasonable doubt would be difficult to manufacture when faced with Marcus's own handwriting documenting systematic criminal behavior. During those months of preparation, I'd found work at another restaurant across town, a legitimate establishment where tips were reported, taxes were paid, and the owner treated staff like human beings rather than expendable resources. The contrast had been stark, highlighting just how toxic the environment at Romano's had become under Marcus's leadership. But I'd also continued monitoring the case, attending hearings when possible, staying informed about plea negotiations and trial preparations. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about validation, about proving that systematic dishonesty has consequences, that people who build success on lies will ultimately be held accountable for their crimes. The whistleblower reward had been processed 6 months after the initial investigation concluded. $2.7 million in recovered taxes and penalties had resulted in a payment of $810,000, life-changing money that represented not just financial compensation, but official recognition that my evidence had been crucial to the successful prosecution. That check had arrived the same day Marcus had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The judge had been particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, noting that Marcus's fraud hadn't been the result of temporary financial pressure or a moment of poor judgment, but rather a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that had persisted for years and showed no signs of stopping. But the most satisfying moment had been watching Marcus's reaction as the sentence was read. The confident businessman who'd destroyed my reputation with manufactured evidence was being destroyed by real evidence, authentic consequences for authentic crimes. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his posture, the way his shoulders had sagged as each year of prison time had been announced. The civil penalties had been even more devastating than the criminal sentence. The IRS had seized Romano's assets, Marcus's personal accounts, even his house and luxury car. Everything he'd built through systematic fraud was being liquidated to pay debts to the government agencies he'd been stealing from for years. But Marcus wasn't just losing money, he was losing everything that mattered to him. His reputation in the business community had been destroyed. His family relationships had been strained beyond repair. His future prospects for employment or business ownership had been eliminated by his conviction record. The restaurant space that had once housed Romano's had been leased to new owners, a young couple who'd renovated it completely and reopened as an authentic Thai restaurant that actually reported their revenue and paid their taxes. The transformation had been both literal and symbolic, a legitimate business rising from the ashes of Marcus's criminal enterprise. I'd driven past that location recently, 6 months after Marcus had begun serving his prison sentence. The building looked different with new signage and fresh paint, but what struck me most was how much lighter the atmosphere felt. The weight of systematic dishonesty had been lifted, replaced by the kind of positive energy that comes from people who build success through legitimate means. The whistleblower reward money had allowed me to enroll in business school, pursuing the degree I'd always wanted but couldn't afford. My thesis was focused on financial fraud in the restaurant industry, the warning signs, the prevention methods, the role of employees in detecting and reporting systematic criminal behavior. But more than the money, more than the education opportunities, what had satisfied me most was the justice of it all. Marcus Chen had destroyed my reputation to cover his crimes, and those same crimes had ultimately destroyed everything he'd built. The man who'd thrived on lies had been brought down by truth. The person who'd succeeded through theft had lost everything to legitimate consequences. Sometimes I wondered if Marcus understood the poetic justice of his situation as he sat in his federal prison cell, surrounded by other white-collar criminals who'd thought they were too smart to get caught. He'd believed that firing me would solve his problems, eliminating a potential witness to his systematic fraud. Instead, it had created an enemy with the time, motivation, and access necessary to document every aspect of his criminal enterprise. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately been the catalyst for his own destruction. If he'd treated me fairly, honored my loyalty, respected my contributions to his business, I might never have looked closely enough at his operations to notice the patterns of fraud. His crimes would have continued indefinitely, hidden behind the facade of a successful restaurant and a respected businessman. But he'd chosen betrayal over loyalty, lies over truth, short-term convenience over long-term stability. Those choices had consequences, and those consequences had finally caught up with him in the most comprehensive way possible. As I sat in my new apartment, looking at the business degree hanging on my wall and the business plan spread across my desk, I reflected on the lessons learned from this experience. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it does come eventually. Truth has a way of surfacing despite attempts to bury it. And sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own actions. Marcus Chen had built his success on systematic dishonesty, and that same dishonesty had ultimately destroyed everything he'd worked to create. I hadn't destroyed him. I'd simply provided the truth that allowed justice to take its natural course. The satisfaction wasn't in his destruction, but in the restoration of balance, the confirmation that actions have consequences, that even carefully hidden crimes will eventually be exposed. In the end, Marcus's greatest mistake hadn't been the fraud itself, but betraying someone who'd been in a position to document that fraud comprehensively. He'd created his own nemesis through his own dishonesty, ensuring that his crimes would be exposed with the thoroughness that only comes from someone who'd observed them systematically for years. The story had a clean ending, the kind of resolution that felt both satisfying and inevitable. Marcus was serving his sentence, paying his debts, living with the consequences of choices that had seemed clever at the time, but had ultimately proved catastrophically self-destructive. And I was building something legitimate, something honest, something that would succeed through hard work rather than systematic fraud. Justice had been served not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through patience, documentation, and the systematic application of legal consequences for illegal actions. It was the kind of revenge that left no room for guilt or second-guessing, because it wasn't really revenge at all. It was simply truth finding its way to the surface, consequences catching up with choices, the natural order reasserting itself after years of artificial manipulation. Marcus Chen had been a waitress betrayed by his boss, and he'd revealed his tax fraud to the IRS. The circle was complete, the balance restored, the debt finally paid in full.